2 weeks after Pony Canyon released their first Famicom game based on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they've come back with their second. And just like with that first game, Heroes of the Lance, they're porting one of SSI's computer games, and for some reason they chose one of the action game spin-offs instead of the role-playing games. Except Hillsfar is an even worse choice than it seems. Since it's only been a few days on Famidaily since the previous Dungeons & Dragons episode, I'm going to skip over the D&D background and the SSI stuff. What you need to know here is that this is based on the Forgotten Realms setting, the most popular setting for Dungeons & Dragons, and the one that eventually became the default. The thing is, Hillsfar wasn't SSI's first game set in the Forgotten Realms. It's the second. And as the second, it was created to bridge the first game, Pool of Radiance, with the third, Curse of the Azure Bonds. Those two games were RPGs. And the idea was you'd complete Pool of Radiance, and then take your characters and import them into Hillsfar, complete your own little quest here, and then import them into Curse of the Azure Bonds. Well, setting aside the challenge of transferring characters between cartridges, which I will point out that the Wizardry series solved, Pony Canyon isn't going to release Pool of Radiance for the Famicom for another 3 months. So we're getting the second game before we get the first game, and there's a very short time between them. The original computer game Hillsfar was not developed in-house by SSI. Instead, they farmed that one out to a contract developer, just like they did with Heroes of the Lance. And in this case, that developer was Westwood Studios. At the time, they were heavily into producing RPGs, so it made sense to use them. It wouldn't be until next year when they invented the modern real-time strategy game. It's not clear who was responsible for the Famicom port, though. ArtDink is a good assumption because they worked with Pony Canyon porting computer games, and there's some superficial similarities in the code, but that's nothing more than an educated guess. Hillsfar is a minigame collection consisting of 4 different minigames, and there are 4 completely separate, distinct stories that you can follow depending on your class. These are the base D&D classes: Fighter, Magic User, Thief, and Cleric, though apparently the Pony Canyon illustrator reinterpreted the Cleric as a monk. If you're multi-classed, then you can follow more than one of the storylines. In fact, this actually breaks some of the storylines, but I'll get to that in a little bit. When you begin the game, you'll have to first create a character, and after you've selected your race, class, and alignment, you'll get your randomly generated stats. One useful thing to know in Hillsfar is that you can't cast spells, and all your interactions with characters are predetermined, so you don't need wisdom, intelligence, or charisma, even if you're working with one of the classes that can use those stats. When you finally created your character, you start out at a camp outside of the city. This is where you can do any other character work, and you have to return here to save your game. Really, the only thing you can do is hit the road, and that's where we get our first minigame. Anytime you're traveling between points outside of the city of Hillsfar, you ride a horse down some of the roughest roads in the world. The horse will have random obstacles placed in front of it, and you either hit A to jump over it, or hit down to duck under them. But the horse isn't obedient, and so sometimes you have to hit A multiple times in order to get it to jump. If you're knocked off your horse 4 times, then you're forced to walk to your destination. That costs you some time, but there's not really a time limit, so it doesn't matter. Okay, you've reached the city of Hillsfar. Now it's time to go in, and here you're faced with a giant map of the city. No features are marked, you have to fully explore it to find anything. But there's really 6 destinations that you should be aware of. First, there are the 4 guilds, one for each of the classes. This is where you go to get your missions to advance your quest line, as well as do other things that are helpful for your class. In the northwest of the city is an arena. That's where you find the second minigame. The one-on-one combats in the arena are the only combat in Hillsfar. Hold down A and press left and right to do strikes, and you can push in those directions without hitting A to block. Combat is pretty simple, and the enemies aren't very responsive, so just remember to be aggressive. The arena is a good way to earn up cash, and for some reason most of the cleric's storyline involves fighting their way through a tournament at the arena. Maybe that's why Pony Canyon thought they were a monk. In the northeast corner of the city, there's an archery ground. This minigame just has you point at targets and then hit the A button to shoot an arrow. It'll drift a little bit based on the weather. There are also rare targets of opportunity that might pop up and be worth extra points. Something to be aware of in the city is that time is passing constantly, and businesses are only open from certain hours. But that's where the final minigame comes in, breaking and entering. Really, all of the dungeons in the game work like this, but breaking into a building works the same for everybody. There are 4 options for opening locked items. 1. You can use a ring that opens things up automatically. You can purchase these rings for 250 gold, but you can also find them around all over the place. 2. You can brute strength it. That runs the risk of setting off traps, as well as alerting guards. 3. You can follow the Mage Quest storyline to the second mission, and get an item that has infinite uses for automatically opening any lock in the game. Which means that magic user thieves are completely broken. Other characters can acquire this item as well, but they're not guided straight to it. And the final option is if you're a thief, you'll have lockpicks. And what you'll find is that there's a set of tumblers in the lock, and you have to locate the matching shape in your lockpicks. You've got limited time, and at the halfway point you can no longer back out of lockpicking. If you use the wrong pick, there's a chance it could break, in which case you can't use that one until you get it repaired at the Thieves Guild. And there's a couple of symbols that will show up in the locks that you don't have a pick for until you get pretty deep into the Thieves' Quest. One thing that you can do is if you see a complex 6-tumbler lock, is back out immediately and then go right back into it, and sometimes it'll just be an easier lock. Once you're inside the building, you'll either have the map of that building if it's a special one, or a randomly selected map, and in this maze will be treasure chests and teleport traps. You also have a timer, and when that timer counts down halfway, a guard enters the building to chase you down. When that first guard enters, the exit to the building also appears. If you don't exit before time runs out, you get arrested and thrown in jail. And that's really everything significant about playing Hillsfar. You go to a guild, you get told to go to a location, you do the minigame there, and then you repeat. The minigames aren't very fun, and they tend to control very poorly. Hillsfar continues the trend of Dungeons & Dragons games just completely baffling Japanese players. I did find a few people who said that they liked it, but a lot more who just had no idea what to do. I think it's pretty clear that I'm not one of those fans of Hillsfar. That said, I don't find it totally unplayable like the Dragonlance games we're seeing on the Famicom. This is merely a not very good Dungeons & Dragons game that fails to capture the spirit of Dungeons & Dragons. It winds up just being mediocre in the way that a lot of these minigame collections from the late 80s and early 90s are. It's there, and the only reason you'd ever revisit it is if you wanted to get the full experience of taking a character from Pool of Radiance to Pools of Darkness. And you can't do that on the Famicom.